This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What in the hell's going on?
What the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on?
I don't know what the hell he's talking about.
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
What the hell's the matter with these guys?
We don't know what's going on.
What the hell's going on?
Who in God's name knows what it's all about?
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? Mark, what the hell?
What the hell is going on is Israel launched a daring operation to rescue 4 Israeli hostages that were being held by Hamas. The images of first of all, you can watch, actually, you and I both watched the video of the actual raid, which was just fascinating. And just the video of the hostages being reunited with their families was so moving and so wonderful. And then you look at the news coverage here in America and the response in America. 200 Palestinians killed to rescue 4 hostages. It's like, it didn't even give like a moment for people to celebrate the reunification of these hostages with their families. We were immediately turning to how terrible it was that Israel had done this. It killed so many people in the operation. I mean, what the hell, Danny?
You know, look, to me, this is just a reflection of the bankruptcy of American public discourse at this point. The New York Times, the Washington Post, major networks, everybody was more focused on the fact that there were casualties. And by the way, completely uninterested in whether those numbers coming from Hamas were true, and less focused on the fact that somebody who has been parading himself as a journalist employed by a U.S. 501c3, right, was holding 3 of these hostages. Another one, Noah Al-Gamani, was nearby. You know, it's grotesque. And I no longer am able to read any of the mainstream coverage of what's going on in Israel with any objectivity because, in fact, it's being presented to us with no objectivity.
So the story of Noah was particularly angering to me because one of the things she said when she was free is that she was being held by a wealthy Gazan family who was essentially making her work as a housekeeper to wash their dishes after family meals. Like, she had to ask for food for herself, but when they would have family meals and they'd knock on her door and say, okay, come out, wash the dishes. And I'm sorry, I said this on Fox the other day, but the days of Jews being used as slave labor for anti-Semites are over. This is no longer acceptable. This is what the Nazis did, right? They took the people out of the camps and brought them into the homes of the Nazi officials and washed their dishes and did their laundry and all the rest of it. The Hamas was literally using the hostages as slave labor. Absolutely unacceptable. And our guest Haviv points out that this was not a refugee camp. It was a civilian neighborhood with a fancy shopping mall and all the rest of it. But if you're in the West and you hear that Israeli hostages were rescued from a refugee camp and that hundreds of people were killed in that operation, why is your first reaction to be outraged at Israel for carrying out the operation rather than being outraged at Hamas for holding people in a so-called refugee camp, or if not a refugee camp, a civilian neighborhood in civilian homes? Every one of these civilian casualties, however many there actually were, because you're right, we can't trust the Hamas numbers, are the result of decisions made by Hamas. It was Hamas who chose to start the war by massacring civilians. It was Hamas who chose to unlawfully take these hostages back. It was Hamas who held them in civilian population centers among families. It was Hamas that refuses to release the hostages. And then when the Israelis came to rescue them, turned out that Hamas had large stockpiles of RPGs and other weapons with which to engage the Israeli forces, which were forced the Israeli forces to return fire and resulted in the casualties. And that's Israel's fault?
Yeah. Now, listen, you'll love this. Here are 2 headlines from CNN from the same day. Israel alleges journalist held hostages in Gaza without providing evidence. That's the first headline. Yesterday marked Gaza's deadliest day in 6 months, Palestinian Health Ministry says.
Palestinian Health Ministry. Yeah.
No, but I mean, Israel alleges without providing evidence is in the headline. And the Gaza's deadliest day, Palestinian Health Ministry, there's no alleges. There's no Palestinian Health Ministry that is run by Hamas and always lies. And look, I realize that a lot of people don't trust the news media anymore. I know there are still good journalists out there, but this has been a disgrace to our country and to the notion of a free press. And by the way, let's talk about the demonstrations that have happened in the wake of the rescue of Noah Al-Gamani and the three other hostages that were held. There were demonstrations the day after in the United States. There was a mass demonstration outside an exhibition about the Nova Music Festival. In other words, about October 7th, in which people set off firebombs, people wore Hamas and Hezbollah flags, called for terrorist groups to hit Israel. I mean, I don't understand what the hell is going on in these countries. I have never been a person who has said, find them all and deport them. Find them all and deport them.
Amen. Amen. We have a great guest, and people are used to hearing us rant. We both just ranted, so we got it off our chest. So now let's bring in an expert who is a recidivist guest on our podcast, and we're so lucky that he is.
So Haviv Rettig-Gur is going to talk to us about the hostage rescue, but also what's going on in the war, what's going on in the north, what's going on in Israeli politics, what's going on with the next month's Bibi Netanyahu address to Congress. Really, just as usual, an amazing conversation. He is the Times of Israel's senior analyst. Before that, he was a reporter for the Jerusalem Post. He's reported from dozens of countries. He was the director of the communications at the Jewish Agency for Israel, which is a wonderful, wonderful organization that has done so much for so many people around the world. We love having him.
Here's our interview. Haviv, welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So you just arrived back in Israel from a 6-week tour of North America, and you came home to the absolutely amazing news that Israel had carried out this incredible operation to liberate 4 of these hostages. But at the same time, you weren't subjected to the horrible reaction in some corners here in the United States. People blaming Israel, imagine that, for killing hundreds of Palestinian civilians in the process of liberating just 4 hostages. I mean, I was so elated by the operation and so disgusted by the reaction from some corners, including in many mainstream newspapers where the headlines were, Israel kills hundreds of Palestinians. First of all, tell us the reaction in Israel to the operation and give us your thoughts on the Western reaction.
Yeah, the reaction in Israel was absolute elation. There is a real, I think, profound despondency, a sense of pessimism even, because it has proven so difficult to get the hostages out. And Hamas has proven, we knew this about them, but still to watch them actually do it, not to be willing to destroy Gaza, to oversee the destruction of it, to drive the destruction of Gaza, to purposefully place assets, to build an entire tunnel network, which is the single biggest thing Palestinians have ever built, for the sole purpose of ensuring massive civilian death toll in a war on Gaza, and to not ever allow the war to end, and to hope for greater destruction in Gaza as a force multiplier, as a means of exerting pressure on us, and all of that surrounding the hostages. In other words, Hamas thinks it's winning, and the more death and destruction happens in Gaza, the more that Hamas believes that. By the way, you saw the Wall Street Journal piece about Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas, who's communicated those very things to Ismail Haniyeh and other Hamas leaders. For anyone who didn't catch the article, I really, really recommend reading it. It's a Wall Street Journal, essentially expose of the Hamas leader in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, and his letters to supporters, to allies, to colleagues. And he explicitly details his desire in clear, explicit language to have massive death toll in Gaza. And so the Israelis have found themselves run up against not a Hamas willingness to suffer massive casualties, but a Hamas desperation, because their only strategy for survival is that Israel's forced to heal through international pressure because of massive Palestinian death toll. So their real massive strategic problem is that the Israeli war can grind on because there isn't enough Palestinian death toll. So they're actively looking for more. Under those kinds of strategic conditions and under those kinds of tactical conditions, how do you rescue hostages? How do you rescue hostages when a large Palestinian death toll is an Israeli liability and a Hamas asset, and the Hamas intentionally builds things in order to facilitate that large civilian death toll. So, long story short, there's a sense that this was almost impossible. And in 8 months, we haven't been able to do it, really, in any significant way. And then this particular kind of operation, which was so clever, the elite police forces disguised heading into where the hostages were held, the pulling out of the hostages, even the gun battle. I mean, the gun battle that begins after the IDF and the police forces are already trying to withdraw. And then Hamas has already understood what's happening and moves in and begins to engage and does so from civilian areas. And the claim by Palestinian officials, by Hamas, is 270 dead. I don't know how Western journalists can believe Hamas numbers at this point. I truly don't know how. After the UN has to revise the death toll down by 10,000, from 35,000 to 25,000, and then pretends that there's some kind of unidentified 10,000. So it's not actually revising down the death toll. If people don't know what I'm talking about, this is about, I guess, a month ago, or even a little more, the UN revised down by 10,000 the death toll to about 25,000. What's fascinating about that is that includes Hamas dead, and the 270, I think, is the final Palestinian number from the operation, is not 270, guaranteed not to be 270, and also includes Hamas dead. And we have no idea. The Israelis estimate 100 dead. You don't have to believe the Israeli number. The Israeli officials, by the way, don't say they know. They say that is the guesstimate of commanders in the field. So the Israeli number is not reliable. The Hamas number is definitely a lie, and includes within the lie the Hamas dead that we don't actually know the number of.
But also, Habib, when you hear news that Israel rescued hostages from a refugee camp, the reaction should be, why were hostages being held in a They intentionally put the hostages in a place where there were a large civilian population, and then they returned fire with weapon stockpiles they had put in a refugee camp. How is that Israel's fault?
The term refugee camp, in the case of Nusayrat, there are actual refugee camps in Gaza right now. There are people who fled Gaza City or Khan Yunis during the battle and are living in tents. What the refugee camp refers to here is what Palestinian ideology calls a refugee camp. It's a city with, sewage and malls. There's one at least beautiful shopping mall in Nusayrat, and businesses and generations of Palestinians who have lived there. And it is not in any sense, except a Palestinian ideological sense, a refugee camp. It's a town, and these hostages were held by civilians who turn out not to be civilians, but to be absolutely, in every sense, Hamas operatives. Hamas' entire MO, its existence, all it is the denial of the distinction between military and civilian. And that's its war plan. That's its strategy for survival. And then the world plays to its fiddle. And that, to me, is very frustrating, because if you do believe there's a difference between a civilian and a military in a war, if you do believe there's such a thing as a war crime, Hamas is a far greater enemy than Israel. Israel accepts the principle, and Hamas is literally challenging the principle in every way. Yes, it's a little maddening to watch the Western response. Not even a moral question. It's so stupid that it's astonishing.
It's true. No, it's true. Listen, about this, I have to say, we agree with you 100%. And, I can echo what you said, but not just what you said about quote-unquote refugee camps. But this has been the case for decades. For decades, that, in fact, quote-unquote refugee camps don't exist as one would think of them. For example, when there were Syrian refugees in Turkey, these are with tents and genuine. These are, in some cases, not just towns, but cities with full infrastructure, full utilities, and everything else. So the notion that they're called refugee camps is merely a service to UNRWA and to the cause of the terrorist groups to keep all Palestinians in this sort of enslaved refugee status for the entire duration of their existence. Let me ask you a little bit about what it means that I am now part of this operation, that the 4 hostages were rescued, living and being held in quote-unquote civilian apartments. What does that mean for the rest of the hostages? What does it mean for the operation overall? What does it mean for the divide between Hamas and the quote-unquote rest of the Palestinian population, which seems much fuzzier now than it nominally was before?
I'll say something counterintuitive, because in theory it means that because Hamas refuses to distinguish between military and civilian, it's nearly impossible for a well-meaning Israeli to. In other words, you can accuse the Israelis of being monsters, but let's imagine that inside this mass of monsters, there's just one nice guy, right? And he's trying to figure his way through this. Well, Hamas's central strategy is to make that impossible. And that is to, again, please read that Wall Street Journal. I urge every listener, that Wall Street Journal piece is Sinwar's letters explaining that he wants a high civilian death toll. But here's the thing about Hamas. Hamas both wants massive Palestinian civilian death, but also profoundly oppresses the Palestinian civilian population. And Palestinian civilians constantly burst out with these angry tirades. There's countless videos of this online from Gaza saying this about Hamas, that they come for us, they're driving us into... Hamas is a sort of Islamist, renewalist movement that believes that it's going to restore Islam to its prominence in history by the mass death of Palestinians. Hamas officials routinely talk about the Palestinians as a nation of martyrs, and that is not a compliment. That is a strategy. And one final point is the compartmentalization. In other words, the reason Hamas was able to pull off October 7, its great achievement as an institution on October 7, was managing to compartmentalize the 1,500 fighters of the Nukba force in ways that Israeli intelligence couldn't get to. That continues. That ability remains. And so it is entirely possible that there's a debate over whether neighbors knew. It's possible they didn't. And that's important to say. And that's important because now some of the neighbors knew. The families who understand that the food budget is higher, right, knows. But it is actually quite possible, given that this is Hamas and given the capabilities we've seen from Hamas in terms of counterintelligence and compartmentalization, that this is actually something that the neighbors in the building don't know. And there's a lot of Gazans right now, throughout Nuseirat, throughout Rafah, throughout Jabalia, which is in the north, a place that the Israeli army is going in and out of now, one of the great Hamas strongholds, who are saying, wait a second, is my neighbor in apartment 3B holding a hostage? Will I only find out when Israeli intelligence finds out and soldiers are going up the stairwell? There's a lot of that also happening. So there's a lot of civilian, that attempt to dissolve the boundary between military and civilian is, again, Hamas's strategy. At the same time, there is a tremendously predatory posture between Hamas and the civilian population of Gaza that is also part of this conversation. So I do not take what some people look at this kind of an event and say, well, the civilian population's in on it. If it were that simple, Hamas wouldn't be the kind of clever enemy that it is.
Okay, I take that point. Although there is another side to this as well, which of course is that so many people do indeed, sympathize with. They are at once victims and sympathizers, but they were certainly happy on the day that October 7th happened. So I mean, it's complex, as you rightly say. But what does this mean for prospects? On the one hand, you could infer that if you suspected that your neighbor was holding a hostage, you might actually be willing to, let people know. And that might be good news for some of the other hostages because that way Israeli intelligence can pick it up. On the other side, it's been reported that Hamas has issued orders that if, in fact, Israeli troops are on their way, if you think they're on their way, the first thing you need to do is kill the hostages. So help us sort of pull all of these threads for the remainder. We've got 5 Americans still there. I know Joe Biden doesn't seem to care about them, but I think we do as well. What does this mean for the prospect of the remaining hostages that are still alive?
Yeah, I mean, I want to draw from what you said just now, which is that there is also this huge support for Hamas. One of the interesting things the polls say is, you're exactly right. One of the interesting things the polls say is that Palestinians feel deeply abused and oppressed by Hamas and also extremely proud of Hamas's achievement as they see it on October 7th. And both of those exist in the same brains at the same moment as they contemplate the vast tragedy that Hamas has brought up on them, people who think Hamas brought the tragedy upon them. So it's complicated. People are always, responding in 3 different ways to everything that's happening to them. We know that to be true. And there are a lot of ideologies at work here. But I think just the other thing you said is, I think, the key to answer to your question, which is the military human intelligence unit was deeply involved in this operation, which means that there were people on the ground, which means that there were Palestinians involved, which means that there is a desire among a great many Palestinians in Gaza, I don't know to tell you how many, but enough to produce this kind of intelligence to get Hamas out. And that's translating into real intelligence for the IDF. And if that can be replicated, if the sense that Hamas is weakening can be replicated, one of the most interesting and totally unnoticed things that have happened in Gaza over the last month is that when the IDF now says to Palestinian civilians, please leave a place because we're going in, they do immediately. And that's a function of two things. We saw this in Rafah. The American administration said to the Israelis, you can't move the civilians out of Rafah, it'll take you 4 months. And then they moved 1 million civilians out of Rafah in 10 days. Now, why were they willing to do it? Two reasons. One, the aid is flowing, and the civilians know that where they're going to go, they believe that where they're going to go, they're going to have food and water and medicine. Two, they believe the IDF will move in anyway, and they believe the IDF will not attack them and kill them if they do leave. And so that level, I don't want to call it trust exactly, but that basic sense of trust is something that we have seen. And so there is a conviction among Palestinians, significant number, significant enough to produce those reactions that are very useful to the Israeli war effort, to move and also to deliver intelligence on where the hostages are. This is the beginning. Now, we don't know if this is also the end and there's no other way to get any more hostages because Hamas still has the unit discipline to actually kill them if there's another kind of rescue attempt. But if this is the beginning of a breaking of enough Palestinians, it doesn't matter if the polls show that there's a rise to 70% support for Hamas. As long as that 30% gets more anti-Hamas, we might have a lot more hostage rescues. And so I think going forward, this is a good sign. Couple that with the way that well over 100,000 people left Jabalia 2 weeks ago. Just Israel said in 14 hours we're moving in. In 14 hours, over 100,000 people were out. And that battle with Hamas killed a major Hamas commander and also went deep into tunnels and also probably took out 10%, the Israeli estimate, 10% of the Hamas fighting forces underground in that area. And then the Israelis pulled out again and the civilians came back. So if we can now do that over time in Gaza, plus there is this turning of some part of Palestinian society, of Gazan society, into people who are willing to give up those hostages, things are going to go much better.
Aside the anti-Semitism that we're seeing in the reaction to the Israeli operation, any military operation, the longer it takes, the longer patience dissipates, right? Has the Biden administration's approach of restraining Israel undermined the success of their operation? They avoided going into Rafah for a very long time. Is this taking too long?
Absolutely. Unquestionably, nobody questions it, nobody doubts it. Left and right in Israel agree on this point. It's absolutely a policy error of the Biden administration. I don't understand. I think I understand what's happening in the Biden administration that's leading them to constantly make these just frankly incompetent mistakes of judgment. The idea that it would take 4 months to move civilians out of Rafah is just, the way I imagine it in my head is that they have a map on the wall of the NSC of like Russia, Ukraine, and they have a map of Gaza, and the maps are the same size, so they don't have a good sense of the sheer scale. Rafah is 5 square miles, okay? It's not a 4-month operation. I don't even understand where that came from. And so there is this sense, the Americans thought there'd be 10 times the Israeli military casualty toll than there actually is. There is a sense among the Americans that the Israelis are incompetent, maybe that the Israelis are malicious and therefore can't be trusted to fight a war without massive civilian casualties. The Gaza City battle, the first battle back in October, November, was actually much more damaging had a huge civilian toll in Gaza City for Palestinian civilians. But that was a battle fought by an Israeli army that hadn't really fought a ground war in 40 years. And as it moved south, by the time it got to Khan Yunis, it was a whole different Israeli military with a whole different tactics. And it was a ground war that went into cities and actually defeated Hamas on the battlefield Hamas built. And now in Rafah, it's incredibly precise. I mean, the death toll is there, but it's in 2 orders of magnitude less than what it was in Gaza City. So the astonishing learning curve of the Israeli military and how to handle this kind of battlefield is something the Americans just refuse to factor in, don't see, don't understand. Look, your National Security Council, your president has to think about China, he has to think about Ukraine, he has to think about, Venezuela. He has to think about a lot of things. He doesn't need to be a great and deep, insightful expert on Gaza. My prime minister does. And so, yes, the Biden administration has been mistaken on Gaza. I don't blame the Biden administration because I'm Israeli and the buck stops with my prime minister. My prime minister stopped the war for 3 months. That was a terrible mistake. This isn't a left-wing critique of him. This is a right-wing critique of him. We could have been past Rafah a long time ago and into the whack-a-mole counterinsurgency type of battle a long time ago, and that's much, lower grade fighting, much less civilian death toll. So, yes, this is taking too long. You're Americans. You can take, the argument to Biden. It is a Biden mistake, but it's my prime minister's mistake for caving to that pressure much, much more than it is the American just policy judgment error.
So let's talk a little bit about America. We had a resolution, U.S. resolution. Theoretically, Israel reviewed, maybe Israel backed, although the stories have been both Israel backed and Israel objected. Security Council resolution pass that calls for a ceasefire. I think it's unclear whether the idea is a ceasefire with no resumption of hostilities, a permanent ceasefire or not. Give us your thoughts about the UN Security Council resolution, what it means, and what it tells you about Washington, and then we can talk about what Washington is thinking as well.
I don't know enough about it. It might be worth saying that. In other words, it almost wasn't covered in the Israeli press. I paid very little attention to it. My colleagues paid very little attention to it. I'm sure our diplomatic correspondent had to read it just because we literally pay him to. Well, you decide whether to put this out or not, but I'll just say I didn't follow the story of the UN resolution very closely. I don't know many Israeli colleagues who followed the resolution very closely. The question of the alleged hostage deal that President Biden delivered in a huge speech, that dominated Israeli press for days.
So let's set aside, because I think from Israel's perspective, what happens at Turtle Bay in New York, where the UN is actually, you are right, irrelevant, to be expected at all times. In other words, they will do what they do. It's like the Human Rights Council. 50% of their work is on Israel, not anything.
And often it's Iran chairing the debate. So it's like,
Exactly. But let's talk ceasefire for a second, because again, we've got Tony Blinken in the region. He's pushing it. We've got the Egyptians who lied on the last ceasefire, altered the offer that was actually agreed to by the Israelis, and now it appears that Israel has agreed to the most recent ceasefire offer, but that Hamas is basically saying no. We keep hearing about this ceasefire, non-UN ceasefire that is being mediated by the Egyptians, the Qataris, Israel, Hamas, that Hamas is refusing to go for it. Can you tell us a little bit about the perceptions of that, the role that the Egyptians are playing? They altered the last ceasefire offer without ever discussing it with anybody. What's happening with that?
Yeah, there are basically two camps in Israel. There's one camp that says, because we distrust this government, that's what every poll tells us, most Israelis say. It's hard for me to even say it now, and I've said it several times, and it's still hard for me to say, but nevertheless, most Israelis tell us in polls by the right wing, polls by the left wing, that they distrust this Israeli government and don't think this Israeli government can win this war because they think it is politicking rather than fighting. And rather than making the decisions, it is caving to political pressures, whether it's from the right or the left or the Americans or whatever, and not actually seeing through a serious viable policy. Those who think the government cannot win this war overlap almost perfectly with those who say, let's finish the war and get the hostages out. And that's not true. It's not perfectly. There's a give or take. I'm giving ballpark figures and the polls change based on the news cycle, but the way I think of it is approximately 40% of Israelis think we stop the war, get as many of the hostages out as we possibly can, even at the cost of stopping the war. And they are not stupid. In other words, in theory, that's a very stupid idea because Hamas will just come back. These are people who say, if Sinwar remains in power in Gaza, that's a terrible blow to Israeli deterrence. Also, it's much, much worse for Gazans, right? Who actually loses more? And don't worry, it's Sinwar. We'll have another war in 2 years, and our one job between now and 2 years from now is to not let them take 245 hostages again. And that'll be a war that this 40% of Israeli society will go fight. In other words, this center-left, it overlaps quite a bit with people who call themselves left and center-left, are a huge part of the volunteer reservist and standing army that actually fought this war, and they're going to be there to fight the next war. So that's one part of Israeli politics. And then there's the other argument, and this is the argument that comes from the right, that says that this Gaza is the weakest of our enemies. Hamas is the weakest of our enemies. And the really big enemies, Iran, Hezbollah is a branch of Iran, are standing there watching, blowing up towns in the north. A third of the city of Metula in the north is demolished. That war in the north that we refuse to actually fight has been terribly damaging to our deterrence. If we can't even defeat Hamas, there is guaranteed to be that desperately powerful war with Hezbollah, because Hezbollah will say they can't even defeat Hamas, and we have 5 times the firepower. And Iran will double down on all of its attacks on us on every front. In other words, if the Americans manage to convince us that we should stop this war with Hamas intact, there will be more war. There's a diverging now, a profound diverging of American and Israeli perceived interests. This is the argument made on the right, where the Americans are looking for stability. That's their overriding, most important thing. It has to do with democratic politics. The convention is in August. But also I think it's just a general American view of the world. And that desperate American need for stability, now that the Iranians have reshaped, through Hezbollah and others, have redefined stability as constantly shooting at Israel, is a disaster for us. And so we need decisive actions and damaging actions to the enemy, while the Americans are desperate to avoid exactly that escalation. And here's the thing. If we let Hamas stand in Gaza, and if we don't meet the threat of Hezbollah in ways that make Hezbollah think twice about a war for the next 10 years, we will have worse war, not less, but much, much more. And there will be more damage in Lebanon, not less. And so that's the debate. And that's the debate that's going forward, and that will define, I think, the next year of the Middle East.
So, Habib, I don't think it's stability as much as it is a pathological fear of escalation. You're seeing this in Ukraine, where the Biden administration has slow-rolled weapons to Ukraine. They don't want to allow the Ukrainians to use weapons on Russian territory because they're terrified that the war would escalate in some way. And that's probably the same philosophy they're bringing to this struggle. Their biggest goal is to avoid escalation with Iran and escalation with Hezbollah. They just want this thing to stop. And at any point that Israel's comfortable stopping it, they will claim victory and move on. Is that how you see it? And how does Israel navigate that pressure from the United States to just stop?
Yeah, and that's not an option our enemies are giving us. In other words, this President Biden made his announcement that there's this Israeli hostage ceasefire offer. And Hamas welcomed it just because it actually looked very good for Hamas. It was a ceasefire offer, and that would a temporary one that President Biden kept saying would be a period during which they negotiate a permanent one. And also President Biden, I think, made the mistake in his speech to present it as an Israeli opening gambit rather than let's say, something the Americans had squeezed out of the Israelis. But it's really the most the Israelis can possibly give. It's frustrating to watch American officials prove to be utterly incompetent negotiators. It's frustrating when there's so much on the line in the negotiations. But what was fascinating was then to watch the arc of the next few days of Hamas's responses. So Hamas's responses to President Biden's announcements were, we welcome, it's an interesting thing. And President Biden then calls the Qataris and the Egyptians, and he says, pressure Hamas, pressure Hamas. And then finally Hamas releases its statement, its answer. And its answer is, if you follow the actual Israeli offer, as far as we can tell from what Biden presented, we don't have the Israeli version of the Israeli offer. We only have the American version of the Israeli offer. Then you discover that, in fact, there's a 6-week pause, and then a stage 2 that doesn't have to happen, in which the Israelis can go back to the war. And Hamas said, no. No hostage gets out unless it's total end of war. Hamas is trying to play on that 50-50 divide in Israeli society, which is couched as, do we end the war for the hostages or not, but is really a vocabulary for talking about deep distrust in this government. That is why I, for example, among many people who are not deeply identified with the political left, have just come to believe that this specific Israeli government can't do the job. It cannot negotiate a deal because the far right won't let it. It cannot win the war because it is deeply susceptible to the pressure from the center left and from the Biden administration. So we have a government that, this is true of Netanyahu for many years now, but that chooses the path of least resistance at all times. But the point is that what Biden is trying to squeeze the Israelis. He's trying to force the Israeli hand. He's trying to commit the Israelis to their own offer by publicizing it. And he runs into the same brick wall everyone always runs into in this region, and everyone is always surprised by it, which is that Hamas will not agree. It will not negotiate. It will not give up the hostages except with the price of its own survival. It is smelling American pressure on Israel to end the war, and it is going to double down. It is going to force the Americans to choose between ending the war, not ending the war with Hamas surviving, or not ending the war and potentially losing an election if the Democrats go haywire in the convention in August. Hamas smells an opportunity, and Biden showed them that there's an opportunity. And they're going to, and so the American moves of the last 3 weeks in this regard have made it much, much harder to actually reach the ceasefire deal. And so everybody who thinks that they're very clever about this region, who thinks they know how Israeli politics work, how Hamas thinking and negotiation work, ends up stumbling over their own feet and ends up generally achieving the opposite of what they want. Again, that means the Israeli leadership needs to be clear-headed, coherent, decisive, and it's a leadership, unfortunately, we don't have right now. It's really bad when the Americans are so clumsy and the Israelis are so easily pressured.
Well, I mean, it's funny. I'm smiling because I'm listening to you. You're a journalist. I used to be a journalist. I still remember so clearly the phenomenon of when an editor had a really bad piece, he would never edit it because it was so bad. It was so difficult. It was so much work. So he would just sort of like, God, and let it go, right? And you'd say, oh my God, how does that terrible piece? And then the editor would get an amazing piece and immediately start futzing around with the little bits. Right, because you pressure where you can. And this is it. Hamas is not subject to U.S. pressure because they understand the Biden administration better than they understand themselves. And so who does Biden pressure? They pressure their friends because their enemies won't listen. It's exactly.
You can
and
pressure.
It's always been
you
that.
can pressure Hamas. You can pressure Hamas. Go to the Israelis and say to them, murder every last member of Hamas. Go for it. We got your back. And then Hamas says, whoa, whoa, whoa. That's how we got the November hostage release. In November was Hamas trying to save its northern battalions. Hamas facing a torrent of anger in the world because they were holding little kids. Hamas trying to explain to the Thai government why it was still holding 6 weeks in Thai workers. And then Hamas was able to. So I agree with you. That's what the Biden administration sees. But here's the thing. If they actually doubled down on the Israelis, the Hamas would feel the pressure. But to squeeze the Israelis is to relieve the Hamas pressure and push away the very result that the American administration. By the way, again, if you've ever negotiated a real estate deal, you would understand this. I don't know why this is difficult. There is a level of
negotiated real estate
here.
Deals.
I did not mean to enter that whole imbroglio. I don't have a right to tell people who to vote for. I don't know that his administration would be more clever on this point. I'm just saying this is such a basic truth of the Middle East and of how negotiations work generally that it is so deeply frustrating that this is beyond the ken of serious high-level American officials.
Yeah, that's a different podcast and a different rant. But yes, you are completely right. But let's talk about the Israeli government because, the way you've described it is really, I think, important. Everybody likes to think of a national unity government as the best of all worlds. But in some ways, it is a formula destined for paralysis, as you rightly say, especially in a country like Israel where everybody has 16 opinions. Tell us about the departure of Benny Gantz, who is one party leader, threatened to leave the Israeli government, laid out his priorities, and then said that Netanyahu did not want to win the war, wasn't going to win the war, and a day after he had promised, because the day he promised was the hostage rescue, he left the government. Help us understand what this means and what's going on inside Israel politically.
As far as I understand Benny Gantz's calculation, it goes something like this. Right now, Netanyahu is, the last 8 months in which Hezbollah has made large parts of Israel's north uninhabitable, and the Israeli government has been just literally unwilling or unable to mount a serious response, at least a response that would satisfy the Israeli public. That is a huge blow to this government's credibility. And the idea that the war in Gaza is dragging on insanely long, the military and civilian populations in Israel are very close. We all know soldiers, and they all come home and talk to all of us. And so there's this sense that the Israeli army was just told stop in Gaza for 3 months for no apparent reason. That was this massive pressure. And so there's a sense that Netanyahu can neither take the left-wing policy, get the hostages out, even at the cost of ending the war with Hamas intact, nor the right-wing policy. No matter the cost to hostages, we're saving the future hostages by exacting a decisive and catastrophic cost from Hamas, the organization. They actually must be defeated. And because he can't make that choice to go to either, we're going to end up losing. There's a tremendous frustration with Netanyahu, and the timing that Gantz chose was timed to an issue that is totally lost in the international press, but is just sending deep and painful shockwaves through the Israeli public right now. And that is Likud's passage of Likud's, not passage, but vote. It was a particular Knesset vote. It has to do with some parliamentary procedure. It doesn't matter, but Likud vote to approve a bill that would maintain the mass blanket draft exemption from the ultra-Orthodox community. We have people, my family, my wife's brothers have spent more time in Gaza than out of Gaza in the last 8 months. More time called up to the north, in one case and with the other brother, than not called up to the north in the last 8 months. And because of that, one of them wasn't there for the first 4 months of his first child's life, who was born while he was in Gaza. And the other one, just basically, I think he was in school for 3 weeks over the course of this very first school year of his college education, and he just missed the year. And so every Israeli family is sacrificing. And the ultra-Orthodox politics, which don't even reflect in many ways the ultra-Orthodox public, which is deeply mobilized and engaged and embarrassed by their lack of service and looking for other avenues of service. But the ultra-Orthodox leadership in this country, the political leadership, which works for the rabbis who are deeply detached from this public discourse, have nevertheless maintained these draft exemptions. Everybody is suffering economically. The economy is in a massive downturn. The defense budget this year doubled. And even as that has happened, the budget for yeshivas, for religious seminaries for the ultra-Orthodox, went from 1.4 billion shekels to 1.2 to 1.8. Huge increase. If you take out all war spending, this is a Bank of Israel report about 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago, you take out all war spending from the equation, there's a government spending increase of 12%. In the middle of a war that the country is buckling under, with people losing jobs and businesses, with tens of thousands of people having abandoned whole areas of the country and their agriculture and their small businesses and their towns. And in that period, Netanyahu has been spending and spending and spending to hold together a coalition so he doesn't fall. And that massive spending and the vote yesterday to maintain the blanket exemptions, a vote that it was an amazing thing to watch. If you go to Likud members of Knesset's Twitter account, X accounts, for me it'll forever be Twitter. You go to their accounts and you will see one after another tormented explanations for why they voted exactly as Netanyahu told them to vote, and why they disagree with this idea, and why there has to be sharing of the burden now that the burden is so very great that the country is buckling under this. If we have a war in the north, we're talking about young people who have been serving most of the last 8 months and will be serving most of the next year. And 13% of the Israeli population doesn't have to take part in that? What is that about? So Gantz timed his withdrawal to that vote, and also as a critique of that vote. Gantz, a former chief of staff of the IDF and someone who is very critical of Netanyahu's reliance on the ultra-Orthodox parties in ways that have produced these very bad politics that have been very hurtful to many, many Israelis. So the campaign is a domestic campaign on these issues of, are we all together fighting, are we not? Is Netanyahu just looking out for his politics and that's why he's delaying a war? I have to just tell you, my dad is a very thoughtful, serious, calm man. He's a rabbi, has a PhD, he's a very serious thinker, writer. And he has come around to the view held by some polls, 1/3 of Israelis, and some polls 45%, I don't know how many, that Netanyahu's extending the war artificially, refusing to win and refusing to lose and refusing to call any ending of any kind, the left-wing one, the right-wing one, because when the war ends, the whirlwind, the political whirlwind comes and the protests come and he has to actually face the people. He hasn't won an election poll since January 2023, not a single one, Netanyahu. And he's doing everything to avoid collapsing. And my dad now thinks that's what's happening. I mean, as of this week, we had that conversation. Let me explain why that's unbelievably shocking. Because that means that we have a leader. By the way, I'm not there yet. There are other explanations. But so many Israelis are there, and that itself is the problem. It means we have a leader who maybe half the people maybe as much as half the people, think is leaving Israelis in those dungeons in Gaza for his political survival, who thinks is spending wantonly and irresponsibly for his political survival, who thinks that every decision ultimately is about him and not about the war, even as every Israeli family sacrifices it. So the Gantz leaving the government is not a small moment. I don't know if he can pull together the kind of coalition that could replace Netanyahu. I don't know if he'd be a good prime minister. I've never seen him as a prime minister. I have a lot of concerns with Yair Lapid, the opposition leader, who when he was a finance minister in government, that was the last thing he ever did in government, which was 11 or 12 years ago, I think was a very bad finance minister. And so I have written long essays about what he did wrong. So, and by the way, just to emphasize how this is not a partisan point, the single most distrusted politician in Israel today is Benjamin Netanyahu in every poll. And the single most trusted one in every poll is Defense Minister Yoav Gallant from the same Likud party. It's not partisan, it's personal. And so Gantz, I think, is trying to now mount an alternative campaign on all of these deep questions of distrust that is not about specifically the conduct of the war, but something much bigger and a bigger kind of distrust and an argument that Netanyahu is no longer what he was 10 years ago, I don't know, but is no longer the kind of man that can see the country through this moment.
That critique of Netanyahu is correct, then in a way he benefits from the pressure from the Biden administration, because the Biden administration he can blame the Biden administration for whatever restraint that he has. Talk a little bit about that. And ironically, there's this tension between Biden and Netanyahu, and yet they seem to have almost a symbiotic relationship. And also the Netanyahu speech to Congress coming up. Good idea, bad idea. How does that affect things?
Well, this was the great joke in Israel when Senator Schumer came out with his, we love Israel, but Bibi is this terrible, right, problem. Obviously, that's a very bad paraphrase. But the joke is that Biden needs to appear to be antagonistic toward Netanyahu for his domestic political reasons, and Netanyahu desperately needs to appear to be holding back the Americans and be antagonistic to the Americans for domestic political reasons. This helps them both. And so they're both committed to the bit. But, that's adorable and let it happen. I'm a political writer. I've been writing about politicians for 17 years now. I'm extremely happy for them to play politics, but also make the decisions we need in wartime. So yes, absolutely. Every time the American administration appears to be, Netanyahu put out that Schumer clip, his people made sure that stayed in the news cycle for as long as they could. And every time they can manage to make the case that there is a Biden-Netanyahu disagreement, they pump it out. They want Netanyahu to look like the great defender of Israel against American pressure. I will say one thing. My criticism of Netanyahu is not that he is not adopting the center-left plan. It is that, in fact, while pretending to have this great fight with the Americans, has caved to that American pressure at every turn. And so, yes, you're absolutely right, and that is exactly the dynamic. And every Israeli I know, you don't have to be a political analyst, thinks it's really funny that in as much as they don't understand it, American officials don't seem to understand that it's really quite helpful to Netanyahu to appear to have these fights with the Democratic administration. As for the speech in Congress, I had some interesting conversations with members of Congress for the Democratic Party on this question, and they're horrified, and they don't understand why it's happening. It's an Israeli ask. The goal is, and from Netanyahu's perspective, there's no downside. If he comes and half the Democratic Party turns their back or doesn't show up, that's a great win for him. He's holding the line and carrying our truth to Washington. He appears the great statesman, and not as most Israelis see him today, which is a basically feckless prime minister who won't get the job done. And if all of Congress is there and stands up and gives him a standing ovation, well, that's great for him as well. So it's a perfect political act by the man. I know why the Republicans want it, and I understand it, and I think it's clever policy. They want the Democrats to have a problem. They want the Democrats to appear wishy-washy on Israel, and they want that moment where the distinction is made between Democrats and Republicans on Israel. The only question we're asking is it useful for Israel? Is that actually something that Israel can benefit from, that speech? I don't think so. As our friend Dan Senor has said, who knows Washington much better than I do. And by the way, I'd like to hear what you think. Every single person on this call knows this question better than I do. But what he said was that back in 2015, when Netanyahu came to Washington, there was a very specific disagreement. He had campaigned with the Obama administration on a specific question that for Israel is existential, the Iranian nuclear deal. And the President Obama had said basically no. And then he brought his case to Congress at the invitation of Congress, and he had a specific ask. There's no specific ask now. It's a public relations stunt. And if that's what it is, then all damage to Israel and the Democratic Party is for nothing. Supporting his own campaign is exactly what he's being accused of doing. I think it might backfire on him in the sense that the gap between the levels of distrust. I'll give you an example. Netanyahu has gone on podcast after podcast and news show after news show in the United States over the last 2 months and refused to interview with the Israeli press. In 2 months, he hasn't gone and interviewed on the Israeli press. The gap between the man Israelis know and the man that will be on the television screens of the world is going to play badly for him, I think. And I don't think he understands that yet. The anger over October 7th, the anger over the draft question with the ultra-Orthodox and the sheer costs to so many to most Israeli families of the last 8 months is something that makes this real. It's not the political game that Netanyahu can't liberate his brain from. This is going to, I think, hurt him terribly.
Yeah. So I have 2 exit questions, but just a side comment to you, Haviv. As I think back on not just October 7th, but the attitudes before it and since, the 2 words that come to my mind so often are contempt and arrogance. There's arrogance inside the Biden administration that they know better than the Israelis. There is contempt both inside the Israeli intelligence and military establishment there used to be for the Palestinians that resulted in a lot of mistakes. There is, and Bibi, I think, has contempt for a lot of his interlocutors and arrogance about how to deal with them. And, it never ends well. It feels almost biblical when that happens. So that at least is my take. But I have 2 actual exit questions because, of course, we've kept you so long. Where are we going next in the war? And what do you think? They're not easy questions. What do you think about the prospects for war in the north with Hezbollah, which is accelerating its assault on Israel's northern communities that have gotten very little attention here?
The war in the south, strip away everything we've talked about and just get down to the actual tactical questions on the ground of the IDF operation in Gaza. There are basically 3 sort of fronts right now. There's Philadelphia/Rafah in the south. Nuseirat was a single operation, but there's going to be more there. And Jabalia in the north, where they're now out, but they're going to go back in. So they're different pockets, essentially. But pretty soon, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, I don't know the military schedule, the entirety of the Gazan territory above ground will have been taken by the IDF once. And taking a place a second time is a whole different, vastly easier act than taking it the first time. You saw that in the Shifa hospital operation, where the first battle of Shifa was long and bitter and bloody, and it took huge manpower, and Hamas had built out a whole ring of all kinds of defenses and reconnaissance positions, and it took, I think, 2 battalions and a month to actually get into Shifa. The second time Israel went into Shifa, killing 200 Hamas fighters and taking 500 captured, took 30 minutes. And so that initial taking of the ground, breaking up the Hamas infrastructure, demolishing the tunnels that are accessible to you from above ground and taking out all the traps and booby traps, that's the hard part, and that will be over. And then we're into the last stage of the war, which is also the longest stage of the war. And it's going to be this long chasing after Hamas, a year, 2 years. If it follows the model of ISIS in northern Iraq, it'll be 5 years. This is something Hamas itself has planned for, wants. Sinwar tells in these letters that the Wall Street Journal cites, he says that we're now going to keep them bogged down in Gaza, and that'll exact costs from them, and we are prepared for that counterinsurgency. Well, the IDF has proven incredibly competent in exactly that kind of counterinsurgency. But Gaza will become the secondary front when that initial stage ends. and then the north becomes the primary front, and then Hezbollah will face a choice. It can go to an escalation because the Israelis politically will be unable to avoid an escalation, or it can immediately say, well, now that the massive ground war in Gaza is over, we were just defending Gaza, we're going to now immediately de-escalate, and then the Americans will pressure the Israelis, and it'll be very difficult to fight that war. That tells me that there's an Israeli interest in having a decisive escalation in the north, somehow as much as possible controlled, but nevertheless something very bloody for Hezbollah that they will not recover from easily and quickly, before the end of Gaza, before the end of that current stage in Gaza, when Hezbollah will have that easy out that'll make it impossible for the Israelis to leverage any kind of international pressure to push Hezbollah back from the border, which no international pressure will be capable of doing anyway. So I think it's quite likely. It's a decision of about 5 people, so it's very hard to predict. It's very easy to predict what 1 million people are going to do and very hard to predict what 5 are going to do. But I think it's quite likely, just based on the dynamic I've described, that we're going to see massive escalation in the north very, very soon. 2 to 4 weeks is the kind of, schedule that I'm talking about, that I'm imagining. Blinken and the commander of CENTCOM were both here in the last couple of days talking with our counterparts in Israel. And apparently, even though a lot of the conversation, that what they released to the press was that a lot of the conversation concerned many other things, apparently maybe the most significant part of the conversation, what wasn't the ceasefire deal that Biden is pushing, was about that northern front. So I suspect that we are reaching a decision point. That doesn't mean they'll make the decision to attack. That doesn't mean they'll make the decision to escalate. But the logic of the war in Gaza tells me the war in Lebanon might be coming faster than we think.
If Bibi is being criticized for drawing out the war in Gaza in order to preserve his political interests, then won't he then be accused of starting a new war in the north in order to remain in office and avoid the reckoning of October 7th as well?
There's double-digit higher percentage of support for a war in the north than there is for the war in the south right now among the Israeli public. He would be supported more if he... The war in the north, it doesn't need to be a war of ground conquest, and it doesn't need to be a war of complex movements of millions of civilians, because we don't have to root Hezbollah out. We have to deliver a fast and painful hit. And then Hezbollah will escalate to show that it can, and then we have to walk them to that edge. We're talking about a very, very bloody, dangerous moment. We're talking about a dangerous moment for Israelis. Hezbollah has the firepower to set Tel Aviv on fire. And that means that the Israeli response will be commensurate and will probably be much greater, because it will have to make it untenable for Hezbollah to do so. Our great and immense and enormous disadvantage in that regard is that these kinds of organizations, Hezbollah in the sense of Iran, and Hamas just because of who Sinwar is and how he thinks, are much less susceptible to their side's suffering, to the destruction of Gaza or Lebanon, and usually see it as their own strategy. So they think it is a good thing. Hezbollah is much more susceptible than Hamas, because there's a larger Lebanon Hezbollah lives in and has to explain that destruction. And if you follow Lebanese social media right now, it's absolutely heartbreaking, because they expect this war. And 80,000 Israelis, something like that, have been unable to go home to the Israeli north. 100,000 Lebanese villagers fled and have been unable to go back over the last 8 months, because they think Hezbollah is going to drag exactly that horrible war to them. And so it's going to be, I don't know how to escape the escalatory logic. It's going to be very, very bad. It's also basically unavoidable. Hezbollah is telling us that we have 2 choices: live with permanent shelling, or have that one fast, hard, agonizing moment. And if you had to choose, which would you choose?
Yeah, it's not going to be simple. I'm watching that with great interest and talking to friends in Lebanon about that. So, and I agree, there's a lot of pressure, countervailing pressure on Hezbollah as well. So we are going to be watching this space closely. Haviv, as usual, just great insight, great explication, and we love having you on.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you so
Danielle.
much.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it.
So Danny, what do you think?
So I thought it was really interesting to talk about Israeli politics. I said this to Haviv, and I think it's true. In some ways, we really do have this symbiosis is generally a positive thing, but in this case, a negative effect of an Israeli government that itself is paralyzed, a perception that the prime minister, who has been prime minister, I think 5 times now, Benjamin Netanyahu, who is sort of trapped on the left, trapped on the right, trapped by his own ambition. And at the same time, the Biden administration, which is making this all worse. And, that fact is indisputable. I have talked to plenty of Arab friends who think exactly the same thing, right? Which is, the one thing we wanted was for Israel to get this done fast, right? We can manage our populations, but just go in, all guns blazing, get this done, and do it fast. And instead, what has been the main aim of the Biden administration? Because in their arrogance, they think they know better than the stupid Jews that run Israel, is take it slow. And the answer is, you're killing more people by taking it slow.
Not take it slow, it's like end it. Wherever, just stop. Stop. They want it over, but they don't want it over with victory. They don't care about the result.
Just like Ukraine.
No, it's exactly right. So in Ukraine, if we had given the Ukrainians, if Biden had given Ukrainians all the weapons that they have now and done it in the first months of the war would be over by now. Ukraine would have won. But no, we're terrified of escalation. We're terrified of provoking Russia. We're terrified of, as our friend Fred Kagan always talks about, we're government being run by PhDs in escalation studies. And it's the same thing here. Don't provoke Iran. We don't want a wider regional war. And they don't want to win. And they would be perfectly happy if Netanyahu said, give us back the hostages, we'll stop the war, Hamas continues to exist, it's over. If that could happen in the next 24 hours, Biden would say, we won, we succeeded, good for us. They don't have it. In none of these cases do they have a strategy to actually win. It's all about not escalating. And when you don't escalate, what happens is the wars get dragged out and public support wanes. And it's just, I don't know how Israel and Ukraine survive another 4 years of this.
I don't know how anybody survives another 4 years of this. But, again, I mean, I'm not going to talk about the election.
No, we're not talking about the election today.
But I will say this. The Biden administration has gone from bad to worse on this. And I will agree with one thing that's very important. I wrote this on our Substack. At this point, we know the manifest weaknesses of both of our candidates. And the one thing that I have started to look at, and I know a lot of other Americans are looking at as well, is not, is Joe Biden too old? Is he a bad guy? Is he doing a terrible job on foreign and domestic policy? Because we know that, right? Is Donald Trump a creep? Is he a philanderer? Is he a person who couldn't accept the outcome of the last election? We know that. Okay, so then let's look at the trajectory. And all I can say is the Biden administration is on a downhill roller coaster with no up. And that trajectory is extraordinarily dangerous. And when I look at the way that they have reacted on Israel, I despair for not just our leadership, but for the Democratic Party. It's a disgrace. It really is. And I know a lot of Democrats who feel the same way.
It is a problem for our politics when you don't have a benign alternative.
It sure as hell is. And by the way, look at our politics and then say to yourself, steroids, that's Israeli politics. No, I don't envy them either. They've got war on every front. They've got a nightmare facing them, and they've got problems with their own politics. And
things are tough all over, Danny.
Things are tough all over. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Join in. Let us know what you think. Subscribe to our Substack, and thank you for being here.
Take care. See you next week.
Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.